before we lift the vehicle, when it comes to removing a wheel, first thing we need to determine is what tools are we going to use to do this. If we're using manual tools, we're going to use a tire iron, a breaker bar. If you were stuck on the side of the road with a flat tire, for example. When we're using manual tools, we need to make sure that we break loose our lug nuts half a turn with the vehicle on the ground. Okay, we need the weight of the vehicle to hold the tire and keep it from turning. So if you're going to go and remove a wheel with manual tools, before we lift the vehicle up, we're going to need to loosen these about half of a turn, break them loose, and then we can lift up the vehicle and finish removing them. So that's an extra step that is required only when we're using manual tools. If we're using power tools, we can go ahead and lift the vehicle up and zip them right off. Next thing, I need to determine what size socket will fit best on my lug nuts here. So it's kind of a trial and error method unless you know the size. Grab your lug nut socket set. We can start with these guys. See, that doesn't even fit in our wheel lug hole. We can move down to our red socket size. Okay, this one is too small. If I flip it over, it drops right into place. And we want it snug, tight a fit. We want as snug and tight a fit as possible. We don't want to run a risk of stripping these lug nuts with a power tool or a breaker bar. Okay, we've got our socket size determined. Go ahead and take the extension, put it on the other side, and we know that this is our correct size for our tool. Okay, now we're going to go and lift the vehicle. We're going to use some power tools to remove this wheel. Show you that method. So we do not need to do anything with the lug nuts. We've lined up our lift points. I'm going to go ahead and raise the vehicle until the wheel is off the ground. The first set of latches. Lower down the safety latches, we're ready to work. Okay, I can get my air hose for our power tool, our socket, and the impact gun. These always have a forward and reverse option. They can be actuated different ways. Sometimes it's a push button. You push it to go forward and push it back to go backwards and reverse. In this case, we have R and F on the side of the tool. So this is in reverse right now, and I would pull this down to going forward. The numbers are for the power of the gun, so we can have low, medium, and high power. Alright, we're going to go in reverse to remove our lug nuts. Go ahead and connect our air hose. Attach our socket. I'm ready to remove the lug nuts. We don't have to use a specific pattern when taking the lug nuts off. We do when we reinstall them, but just keep the tool tight up against the wheel. We want to make sure it doesn't pop off and scratch our wheels. So all the way over the lug nut, and keep it snug. There's one. Okay, make sure we get all the way over the lug nut like that. Drops down into place. 2. Don't lose your lug nuts. The air hose will take them out. Keep them somewhere safe until we get the wheel off. Okay, there's 5. Pull our wheel off here. Drop it down. Okay, now that we've got our wheel removed, you can see that we have a lot of components exposed that we can do a quick visual inspection of. So anytime wheels come off the car, we want to be checking our suspension components like these control arms, ball joints. We'll learn more about those, but just general visual inspections. Make sure this rubber boot isn't leaking grease. You can catch any red flags that way. Whenever we're rotating our tires and a wheel comes off, we also want to check our brake pad thickness. You can see the window in our brake pad, our disc brake caliper. Here's our caliper, and there's usually an inspection window. in these where we can see down in there and take a look at our brake pad thickness. Okay, so it's a lot like a sandwich. Okay, so in our inspection window, the first thing you usually want to locate is the brake rotor. That's kind of the middle part of our sandwich. So in this case, we can only see the inner pad, which is this black area right here. That notch, that valley that you see, is actually a minimum thickness indicator. So if you get really close, it's not cut all the way through the rotor. So if the brake pads started to wear away to the point where we couldn't see this notch anymore, it's an indicator of time to replace the brake pads. Okay, so we can see the silver piston of our brake caliper, then the backing plate, and this is the brake pad itself. Okay, these look brand new, and those are touching the rotor directly. They even make a tool if we want to get an exact measurement of the thickness of our brake pads. So this is very handy if you just rotate tires for someone. You can actually give them a readout of how much brake pad they have left as well. This is just a feeler gauge. It has different sizes stamped onto it in millimeters and inches, and we're going to stick that in between the backing plate and the rotor and try and measure the size of that brake pad. Okay, so if I start with this yellow one here, I can stick that down in our caliper, and you can see that it's not big enough. So we're going to go up to the next size. This is this green one. It's a little better, but we still have some space. And that's a nice tight fit in there, no movement. So we know that is the thickness of the brake pad. If you look right here, it says 10 millimeters. So we could tell the customer that they have 10 millimeters of brake pad left on their front brake. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and reinstall our wheel. We're going to do that by hanging the wheel on the lug studs, and then we're going to start each lug nut by hand and make sure that they thread on those lug studs correctly. Just a couple threads. Okay? If they bind up or stop or don't screw on easily, we need to reverse and start over again. Make sure those are threaded on correctly. Also, the tapered side of the lug nut needs to face the wheel. Okay, so we don't want to put the flat side in. This lug nut needs to go in this way towards the wheel. That taper is going to match the taper in the wheel itself and help center it on the hub. Okay? Okay, we're all set. Let's go ahead and install our wheel on the studs. Wheels are generally pretty heavy. To get the weight off of your back, personally, a technique I like to do is keep my elbows on my thighs. Use this as a pivot station, but we want to don't lift with your back to get these up on the vehicle. Okay. I'm going to bring it up. Watch my fingers. I'm just going to line it up on those lug studs. Okay. Next, I'm going to get a couple lug nuts started by hand to hold this wheel in place. Like that, couple threads. A lot of times it helps to use the socket as a little tool extension, a nut driver. We're putting that tapered side in towards the wheel. Okay, I've got all 5 lug nuts started by hand, just a couple threads, so they are still loose, but they're holding the wheel on now. From here, I want to run these down in a star pattern. Okay, so I'm going to stay away from the 2 lug nuts closest to the one that I just tightened. So we'll tighten this down in a pattern such as this. A lot of times we'll use a power tool to speed this up, but we want to make sure that we don't over tighten these with the power tool. We are going to lower this down and put a final torque on them with the torque wrench to make sure they're right at the foot-pound torque specification. Okay. So what I'd like to do that, get our power tool. So something we can do to help limit the torque that we're putting in with the power tool so we don't go over, we don't do it too much, is we can turn it down. I have it now in forward because we're going to be putting the lug nuts on, and you can tell by this number dial what power level we are at. So this is power level 3. I'm going to go ahead and turn it down to 2. You can hear that's medium. And we'll go all the way down to low, which is 1. Okay, that's just going to help us avoid putting too much torque into the lugs. The job of the impact right now is just to save some time. So we have to sit here and screw each one in by hand. Alright, so I'm going to use the star pattern. I'm just going to snug these down just enough so we can put some weight of the vehicle on the wheel and do the final torque with the torque wrench. Okay? So just a little bit. Okay. Next, started right here. Do the star pattern. I'm going to go either to this one or across to this one. I want to avoid going to the lug nuts that are closest to the one that I just tightened. So snug this one down. Okay, that's snug. Now from here, I'm going to avoid the 2 closest to me. I already did this lug nut, so I'm going to come down here to the 7 o'clock position. Snug, good. I've done this one, this one, this one. Stay away from these 2. I'm going to go over to our 2 o'clock position. Snug that one up. Just like that. We can finish off across at 10 o'clock. Okay, and that's enough to support the weight of the vehicle. You can always check by hitting the wheel. There shouldn't be any play. The wheel should not wobble back and forth. If it does, we need to tighten them up a little bit more. These are not done. They are not torqued at their specification, but it's enough that we can set the car down and use the manual torque wrench. I'm going to go ahead and bring the vehicle down just to when the tire touches the ground, and that's going to hold the tire into position while I torque it with the torque wrench. Coming down. Okay, tire touched. Torque specification for this vehicle calls for 90 foot-pounds. So I'm going to take our torque wrench here on the foot-pound scale, and at first I'm going to find 90 along the edge where these numbers are. Okay, and 90 is right here. So if I follow that little line down, I want to twist the collar up so that a 0 lines up with the 90 line. And that tells us that we're at 90 foot-pounds. So when that 0 rolls around, we should be right at the 90 line. There's 90. Okay, let the locking ring drop. And now our handle won't spin anymore. So this torque wrench is now set at 90 foot-pounds. Go ahead and grab your socket that you used on the power tool. Remember, we're using 1/2-inch drive, so everything will match. Now I'm going to apply final torque to this wheel using our manual torque wrench. Okay, we've got the vehicle lowered down, so our final step now is going to be to do the final torque of the lug nuts with our torque wrench. So I'm going to do the star pattern again, and this time I'm going to stop and listen for when the torque wrench clicks, and that's going to tell me that we've reached our 90 foot-pounds of torque and we need to move on to the next one. So I'm going to start down here in the bottom left, push down until I feel it click. There we go, that's 1. So now I'm going to move across, sticking with the star pattern. 2, and move across down to here. 3, remember we're just staying away from the ones next to what we just tightened. So I'm going to go across over here. Number 4. 5. 4. And finally across to number 5. 5 clicks. We now know that all 5 lug nuts have been tightened to 90 foot-pounds. Torquing them with the torque wrench and to the proper specification prevents us from stretching the threads on the studs, damaging them that way. Sometimes if you tighten them or over tighten them, when you go to rotate your wheels later, we end up breaking a stud off. So deeper in, if we have lug nuts that are different amounts of torque, let's say we only did these to 40 foot-pounds and these are cranked up to 100 foot-pounds, that can cause stress on our brake rotor and possibly warp those components when they heat up and cool off. So we gotta be very careful when it comes to just simply removing a wheel and reinstalling it, that we follow the correct procedure, look up our specifications, and get those lug nuts to the proper torque. It'll also keep your wheels from coming off the car.